Back when I ran in college, I was desperate to accomplish huge things. I had big goals, but very mediocre amounts of talent. I had Olympic dreams and D3 middle of the pack abilities. And I quickly realized the only way I could possibly accomplish everything I wanted to was to make drastic changes to my stride, to make it as efficient as possible. But be warned, while these changes made me more efficient and faster and gave me significantly more control of my stride, it also made me significantly more prone to the risk of injury. But it won't make sense to explain that risk of injury until you understand the principles of the stride. My attempt to maximize my performance on very limited talent led me to study hundreds of different elite runners' strides to see if there was anything I could glean to give me an advantage. And what I noticed was that all elite runners run the exact same way. And I know what you're thinking. You're gonna say, well, that's not true, because I know so-and-so has a weird arm swing, or so-and-so has that weird leg swing, or that head bob. And that is true. Each runner has their own unique idiosyncrasies that work for them. And if you're like me, you maybe even tried to copy some of those weird idiosyncrasies. I remember watching Bekele run with his foot coming all the way up to his butt on every stride and thinking, that must be the key to running fast. And I originally tried to copy that exact motion. But something was wrong. And that's because instead of getting faster and more efficient, I ended up with this weird, lanky, long stride that spent more energy trying to look fast and look efficient and mimic someone else's stride, and it wasn't working for me. So what's the deal? Do elite runners all have the same stride, or are they all very unique? Let me explain with an analogy. You might look at the winners of recent car races and think, well, they're all very different. One is orange, one is purple, one is green, one is blue. But what I'm saying is, that's not super important. If you look at cars that won recently, they probably had similar engines or driver skill sets. It's what's under the hood or the fundamentals that truly matter. So what's the bottom line? What is the runner's form equivalent of under the hood? After watching tons of videos and copying weird strides and getting nowhere, I finally started to see it. There are three core principles that allow you to run most quickly and economically, and every elite runner has them. And all those little weird idiosyncrasies, they matter, but not in the way you might believe. But before I can help you make sense of that, I first need to explain what those three core principles are and how they're related. Now, all three of these core elements are super related. You can't possibly change or improve one of them without it also changing and improving the others as well. So here are the three core elements of an elite runner's stride. Number one, all elite runners' strides have an exaggerated knee lift. Their stride essentially opens on the front side and not the rear. Number two, all elite runners have very, very, very short ground contact time, meaning the time the foot is on the ground in between strides is significantly shorter than the average person. And this is important for two reasons that I'll explain later. And number three, finally, all elite runners have very little rotation in their shoulders and hips. While running, the hips and shoulders always stay squared to the front. Now I want to clarify that opening your stride in the front doesn't mean landing with your foot in front of your center of gravity. Your foot still needs to come down underneath your center of gravity. It just means a more forceful and powerful lift and thrust with your hamstring, so your knee comes a little bit higher up during that part of the stride. Back to what we talked about earlier with each runner's idiosyncrasies. And the reason I said they don't matter is because they're not transferable from person to person, but they are super critical sometimes to that one individual. And the reason is because the key is to prevent your hips and shoulders from rotating. And since each body and every person is different, it's imperative to find the right leg swing and arm swing and motions that help you prevent your hips and shoulders from rotating. The other thing I mentioned earlier was that all three core elements are interconnected, and they are. Because if you can shift your stride to open up in front and not in the rear, you'll have less hip-shoulder rotation. Because one of the biggest things that causes hip rotation is when your leg goes too far back and pulls the hip back with it. The hip joint can actually open to the front though without causing rotation. And if you reduce your hip rotation, you'll have less ground contact time because it means your foot isn't going as far back. You're literally pulling your foot off the ground quicker. And it means you're getting your foot off the ground quickly. And if your ground contact time shortens, it means your stride is opening up in the front. So clearly you can see that if you change one element, it's actually changing and improving all of them. Now here's the best part. There are two significant advantages that you get from having a short ground contact time. And I'm gonna explain the first one with this, a regular old bouncy ball. If I drop the ball, what happens is it hits the ground, it compresses, stores energy, then releases that energy, shooting it back into the sky against gravity. But what happens if I put my hand on the ball for just a split second after it lands? Nothing, right? It doesn't bounce back. That stored energy is dissipated. And you're probably wondering, what does this have to do with running? Well, your foot and your leg actually operate very similarly to the bouncy ball. When your leg impacts the ground, the muscles and the tendons especially can absorb energy and then release that upon the next toe off, beginning the next stride. It's called the stretch shortening cycle. And this allows you to recapture as much as 50, 60, or even 70% of the energy from the previous stride instead of having to create all of the energy for the next stride on your own. But here's the thing, it only works if you have short ground contact time. Otherwise, your body weight sitting on your foot is like my hand sitting on the bouncy ball. It diffuses the energy and you're not able to recapture it and reuse it in the toe off of the next stride. And this is why it's imperative to have short ground contact time. The less time your foot spends on the ground, the less of that energy is dissipated and more of it is recaptured and used in the next stride. This is also a big part of the reason why super shoes affect people so much differently. It comes down to the same principles. Those springs in the shoes, you need to get your foot off the ground quickly to recapture the most of that energy. And people who run with their foot on the ground for a longer period of time are not able to recapture that energy, as well as people who get their foot off the ground really fast. So that's one reason it's important to keep your foot off the ground. But the other reason is because when your foot is on the ground, it's tense and the muscles are working hard expending energy. But when it's in the air, floating in between strides, you can relax those muscles and let them essentially recover. So the more time you can spend as a ratio in the air compared to on the ground means you're recovering more and expending less energy. Alrighty, now I should emphasize that I am just a sample size of one. So I don't know how this would affect everyone, but for me personally, I definitely became more injury prone after making these changes. And I'm gonna do my best to summarize or explain kind of why I think that is. And I would explain it as such. Remember in high school physics class where the teacher had the egg and threw it against the concrete wall and it cracks? And then they take another egg and throw it against a bed sheet, and because the bed sheet kind of expands a little bit upon impact, the egg doesn't crack. I feel like that's what happens with short ground contact time. When you have the short ground contact time, the energy and impact is felt over a very short duration, so it's very impactful and intense on your leg. Whereas with a longer ground contact time, that's a little bit more time for that impact to be felt and accepted by the muscles and bones, and as a result, it's not as intense. And so I feel like, for me personally anyway, that's a big part of why having the shorter ground contact time increased my bone and skeletal muscular injuries. A great runner uses their own energy and effort minimally in a race and instead relies on known principles like the stretch shortening cycle and inertia and gravity to capture energy from the previous stride to propel them forward. And by doing so, they can use less energy and move at a quicker pace. And this is the key to running at a high level and beating more talented athletes than yourself. Now, this video has gotten to be just a little bit long, so I'm probably going to wrap it up here. But if there's interest, I can always make a second video explaining some of the details about how I went from transitioning from where I was to getting to this point of having a high knee drive, short ground contact time, and very minimal rotation in my shoulders and hips.